So you have Ph.D. in geophysical sciences. You have published over 180 articles, and you have several books. And your latest book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, is I read the book and I really liked it because we don't have. I mean, at least I haven't come across with publications and books that cover this topic in a balanced and objectively. And I see either it is we're gonna die or it is you're a climate denier, and nothing seems to be in between. So I was really pleasantly surprised reading your book. And I want to read, before we get started, I want to read one this paragraph in your book. I think it's going to be a great segue to Bovaer that we're going to talk about, a food additive. You write, quote, human-caused climate change is then elevated to the role of the dominant predictor of societal change. Multiple possibilities of the future are effectively closed off as climate predictions assert their determinative influence over food production, health, tourism, recreation, human migration, violent conflict, and so on. Other environmental, economic, and social factors that influence these societal problems then become marginalized. And this is, I think I completely agree. And you mentioned here that I guess that's why we are now adding this food additive to lactating cow's feed in order to reduce methane emission. What can you tell me? What do you think about this? For me, it seems absurd, but tell me I'm wrong.
Oh, it's crazy. I mean, it's basically a poison. At least in the U.S., it's been classified as a poison, and people are claiming that if you feed it to cows, I guess they won't be poisoned, but somehow the cows will, emit less methane over their life cycle, and it's a ridiculous thing to do. And it's not just stupid and pointless, but it's a dangerous thing to do. It just makes absolutely no sense. Absolutely no sense.
For example, if let's say because I want to know how justified this is. I want to know how this is going to reduce methane, because we are doing this all in the name of reducing methane emissions. And because we have a goal to keep the global temperatures below below, I think, let me just, what the number was. The number is 13.7 degrees Celsius, and that's 56.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is where our aim is to keep this baseline. So it needs to be around this baseline, but not 2 degrees Celsius more than this. And we're doing this all in the name of not having a irreversible damage to our climate. And this is Bovaer's direction for use, right? So it says, warning, not for human use. Caution should be exercised when handling this product. 3-nitroxypropanol may damage male fertility and reproductive organs, is potentially harmful when inhaled, and is a skin and eye irritant. Personal protective gear, including eyewear, a dust mask, and impervasive gloves should be worn when handling this product. This is a toxin.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a chemical toxin that we're feeding to cows. Lactating cows, apparently lactating cows, they emit twice more methane emission than non-lactating cows. So this is in trial. It's not FDA approved yet, but it's in trials, and dairy products are already on supermarket shelves. So since we are going to the extent of feeding cows with something chemical and toxic, I want to know how bad the situation is.
Well, the situation is not bad at all. Yes, the climate is warming, and it's been warming for about 150 years. And, part of that may be caused by CO2 and methane emissions, but a lot of it is natural climate variability. And it's very difficult to separate out what's natural versus what's human caused. But apart from that, The weakest part of the whole argument is whether warming is dangerous. I mean, apart from the slow creep of sea level rise, there's no particular reason to label warming as dangerous. People don't like cold winters in the US. A lot of people are moving from the northern states to the southern states to avoid cold winters, so a little bit of warming doesn't seem to be noticing that the whole issue of warmer temperatures causing worse extreme events. Well, apart from heat waves, or at least slightly increasing the intensity of a heat wave, hurricanes, floods, all of these other things are not exacerbated by warming. And if you're worried about a little bit of increase in temperature making heat waves worse, well, they're making the cold extremes less cold, and an order of magnitude more people die from cold than they do from heat. So overall, by increasing the temperature a little bit, we're reducing mortality from temperature extremes. So this whole idea that this is an existential threat, that we urgently need to do something, is just it's propaganda in the interests of a specific worldview, a neo-Malthusian worldview. And it's not a human-centric worldview. So for the last 100 years, I mean, we've already warmed 1.2 degrees centigrade, over the last century. And we've done fine with that warming. The population has increased hugely. Poverty levels are down. Agricultural productivity is less. Fewer people per capita are killed in extreme weather events. So I say that we've done pretty well over the last 100 years, even though we've had warming temperatures. So we need to stop being afraid of warming temperatures. I mean, sure, we don't want to endlessly, dump stuff into the atmosphere, but thinking this is a crisis that we should start to poison ourselves over is just insane, in my opinion.
In preparation for this interview, I talked to three representatives of Gen Z, and they're between the ages of 20 and 26. And it was very funny was they all three said the same word: irreversible damage. And when I hear the same word, exact same wording, that is very interesting. And when I was researching, I also saw the same word everywhere: irreversible damage. And I thought, if I think about something, and if I realize something, if I do research and realize something, there are many different ways of describing things, right? But when you hear the same wording everywhere, and English is not my native language, maybe I'm wrong, maybe that's the only way to describe it, but so it was very surprising. And the conclusion that I came from talking all three of them was that I guess by the way, they all live in anxiety. They have an anxiety because of climate change, and it's real. They do really feel anxiety, and they're living with anxiety. And I'm going to tell you why. Because what they told me is the world is getting warmer, which is going to lead to ice caps melting, sea levels rising, less livable space, less place for agriculture. So there will be desertification. So we will not have enough food, not enough drinking water. And then all that is going to lead to massive immigration. So there will be, and then obviously overpopulation is another topic. So we are overpopulated, and then we don't have enough livable space, no food, no drinking water. And no wonder people are living in anxiety. And like as you wrote in your book, the headlines that we can see everywhere is the clock is ticking towards climate catastrophe. We face a direct existential threat, and no wonder these younger generation are living in this anxiety. How much of this is true? How are we causing this? What are we doing? For example, I'm just going to tell you, your interview to Dr. Jordan Peterson has a special label underneath, sort of to prevent people from misinformation. And it says, and it's sort of correcting it. I don't know. It says climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And that's the label that you have under that interview.
Okay, well, that's a false statement. The climate system is exceedingly complex. And, forget fossil fuels, look farther back in time, and we've seen wild swings of the climate over geologic history. And even over the last several thousand years, there have been, periods when there have been, large changes and shifts, and then it comes back. And so trying to sort out natural climate variability from human-caused climate change, you can't do it in any straightforward way. What people do is use climate models, which are totally inadequate for this purpose. I mean, the climate models disagree by a factor of 3 about how much warming you would expect from a doubling of carbon dioxide. And this is in the UN climate assessment reports. This isn't something from climate deniers. I mean, we don't know how sensitive the climate is to increasing carbon dioxide. And with regards to natural climate variability, the climate models don't correctly handle solar variability. They miss the solar indirect effects. They don't correctly handle the multi-decadal to millennial scale ocean oscillations. There's a factor of maybe 4 uncertainty in how the climate models deal with a volcanic eruption. So there's so much that we don't know about not only natural climate variability, but we don't even know this most basic parameter. How sensitive is the climate to doubling the concentration of atmospheric CO2? So we just don't know. So a lot of what's been going on could very likely be natural climate variability. But then we come back to the issue, why do we think warming is bad? I mean, the slow creep of sea level rise has been very slow indeed. There are some regions where sea level appears to be rising very rapidly, but that's mostly because the land is sinking, okay, due to geologic processes, groundwater withdrawal, even the withdrawal of fossil fuels, can cause the land to actually sink. And this is, a problem that some big cities in coastal regions are facing in the US and Asia in particular. So, I mean, sea level rise is really a slow creep. Even if you believe the climate models and you believe the UN climate assessment reports, for the moderate emissions scenario, we're looking at 1 to 2 feet more of sea level rise by 2100. And those are with climate models that, in my opinion, are too sensitive to carbon dioxide. So I would say 1 to 2 feet is even on the high side of what we would expect. And, that's a very slow creep. I mean, we've already seen, like 9 or so inches in the last 100 years of sea level rise. Most of that's from natural causes. The glaciers and the ice, particularly Greenland, there was a big melting like in the 1930s, which really had very little to do with CO2 emissions. It had to do with the ocean circulation patterns. And then, that slowed down in the, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then it started melting again. Part of this is just the natural oscillation of the ocean circulation patterns. So unless you pay sufficient attention to natural climate variability, you really can't sort out what is human caused. And like I said, even if we assume that all of the warming over the last 100 years has been human caused, I mean, we've done really well, like I said before, with increases in agricultural productivity, fewer lives lost from extreme events. So what is there to worry about? Now, this isn't to say something bad won't happen in the 21st century in terms of the climate. For example, in the early 1800s, there were 3 hugely explosive volcanic eruptions, which, changed the climate quite a bit, for decades. And even the UN climate assessment report says if we were to see that again in the 21st century, that would fundamentally change the trajectory of the 21st century climate. And it would. I mean, and in the second half of the 20th century, we saw a grand solar maximum. So there was more solar heating. Some people, were expected to see some sort of a solar minimum in the 21st century. Whether it will be a grand solar minimum, probably not. But, until we understand these things, we're not really going to get a handle on how the climate of the 21st century is going to play out. And if something bad does happen, it's more likely to be associated with natural climate variability, volcanic eruptions, or something like that, than it is to be from CO2 and methane emissions.
Okay, I'm really actually got really curious now about volcanic and the what was the other one? Volcanic eruptions and solar activity.
Yeah.
But I just want to ask you. So, the we cannot measure how does a methane emission affect the warming, can we? Is there a way to measure it? Because if we're adding like if we're putting, so let's say
Mhm.
there is lactating cows do emit methane, right? So they emit methane, and let's say now they are emitting, I don't know, 50% less methane. My Can we actually measure
Oh,
that effect?
not directly. Okay, we know the infrared emission spectra for methane, how it affects the Earth's radiation. We know the chemical pathways for how methane breaks down. I mean, methane is a relatively short-lived molecule. I mean, it breaks down into CO2, water vapor, ozone, depending on what it interacts with. So the methane molecule is not very stable in the atmosphere, unlike carbon dioxide, which is pretty stable. So, I mean, so there's that factor. Um, and then, how does that change the climate? Well, the only thing you can do is, use a climate model with more or less methane in it and hope that the climate model is fit for purpose of determining that. And it really isn't. So, I mean, we have some sort of a handle, but the issue with methane, and there's a lot of natural sources of methane. Oh, wetlands, okay, is a big one. A fossil fuel exploration is a big one, but the wetlands, and we've seen it, and the methane concentration in the atmosphere is pretty variable. It was going down in the early part of the 21st century. Now in the last 10 years, it's gone way up. And is that fossil fuels or cows? Well, no, they've identified it as coming from the tropics, and apparently from some wetlands or something going on in the tropics. So it's not, trying to change the digestive system of cows isn't really going to help that situation. So it's just really stupid, in my opinion.
So, so you're saying exposing us to a toxic chemical that can damage male fertility and reproductive organs is not worth it.
Absolutely, it is not worth it.
Okay. Now I wanted to ask you about because in an interview to Dr. Jordan Peterson, you mentioned about hurricanes. Because another thing that causes anxiety in younger generation is now because global warming is gonna cause more hurricanes than they were before.
Okay, actually, no. Even it appears that global warming will cause fewer hurricanes. This is what the climate models say. The issue is whether the hurricanes will be more intense, okay, stronger, higher winds. And there's a lot of debate on that. And if it does increase, it would be, a pretty small increase. As far as I can tell, the main thing that might be coming from more hurricanes is more rainfall. As you have higher sea surface temperatures, at least in the US and the Gulf of Mexico, we've been seeing, a lot of hurricanes with unusually large rainfall. So that might be the one issue to be concerned about is more rainfall from hurricanes, at least in the lower latitude hurricanes. In the US, where I pay most attention to the hurricanes, is on the Atlantic coast, the more northerly, like in New York City or something, you don't see heavier rainfall, but you are seeing heavier rainfall in the Gulf of Atlantic. Whether this is associated with warming or with just whatever natural weather variability. We don't know unambiguously, but it seems plausible, at least to me, that we might see more rain. And this just raises the challenge is that we need to figure out how to better, manage our water. Too much, too little, either drought or floods. I mean, you can manage this with engineering, with dams and reservoirs and all this kind of thing. And we, need to be more proactive in figuring out how to manage our water resources. So that seems to be overall, with growing populations, more water would seem to be a good thing, as long as, you're not flooding and you can manage it in reservoirs and things like that.
But how are we going to do it if the main attention is on man-driven
Oh, I know.
CO2 emission?
The amount of resources, financial resources, and just basic human capital, scientific research, and brain power that has been wasted on this whole issue rather than dealing with our real problems. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, we've damaged our energy infrastructure by getting rid of nuclear and coal and gas in favor of wind and solar. And the environmentalists don't even like hydropower. And so, I mean, this kind of power turns out to be very expensive. It's intermittent. It places great strain on the transmission grid. It's just, I mean, there's no way you can run an industrial economy off of wind and solar. And so we just need to disabuse ourselves of that notion. And so not only are they screwing with our energy supply, now they're after our food supply, no fertilizers, which are produced using fossil fuels, and now the whole cow situation. I mean, this is just insane. It's an anti-human agenda. And it just makes absolutely no sense. It's a certain worldview, a neo-Malthusian worldview. We have too many people, capitalism is bad, the environment is fragile, and therefore, we need to control everything. And then we'll just destroy everything while we're controlling it. And we're in a bad place right now. But, I think we're starting to turn the corner a little bit. People are saying, well, this is just infeasible. We can't do this. And really, all these deadlines, and the end of the world was supposed to have come, a few years ago, and we're still doing just fine. Maybe we just need to focus on our more immediate problems and trying to deal with them, and then have it in the back of our mind that, yeah, we should probably try to emit less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but that shouldn't be the priority. Just having this whole climate is everything approach, like that quote from my book, that, and when anything bad happens, like the dam breaks or whatever happens, or the sea is running out of water, they blame it. Oh, it's global warming, climate change, fossil fuels. When at the end of the day, it comes down to poor governance, bad decisions, and lack of paying attention to your infrastructure. But the politicians don't want to be held accountable, for blame, so they just throw up their hands and say global warming, climate change, out of our control, and therefore we don't really confront our real problems, many of which have, reasonable solutions that, everybody could agree on if we would just pay them some attention and put some resources towards them, rather than spending all of our financial resources and intellectual capital on the fossil fueled warming issue.
I wanted to ask you, so I know that some people are already understanding what's happening and do not live in anxiety. However, I mean, there are still, for example, what is it, like, governments do participate in conferences, right? There is a conference by UN and other organizations that if you're not part of, let's say, Paris Agreement or other climate related organizations, then you cannot get your product sold, or you cannot be part of this sort of the club, right? You need to be part of certain. So you have, there is a pressure of playing into this, and
I know that the coercion from the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and all that is huge. And what it's going to take. So I would expect President Trump to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Malay and Argentina has already withdrawn, and I would expect other places to follow suit. I mean, it's not solving anything. For all of these agreements and the hot air and all of this expended, we're still fossil fuels continue to provide 80% of our energy, and that hasn't budged. And so it has really had no effect other than to destroy economies, damage the environment, change the geopolitics in Africa, where the country's being raped for its natural resources. I mean, on and on. A lot of not good things have happened as a result of all this, apart from just preventing us from dealing with the real things that, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Like, all of these have been put on hold as we try to stop fossil fuel emissions. I mean, no poverty, no, prevent hunger, all of these kind of things, cheap access to electricity. All of these things are being really hurt even by this insistence on, getting rid of CO2 emissions. So, in the last 10 years, actually, the hunger problem has really exacerbated, particularly in Africa a bit. That was on a nice trajectory, but all of this crazy stuff that's going on is we're going backwards in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, this is just absolutely nuts. And I understand, especially for small countries, they just have to go along in order to get aid, for trade and all this kind of stuff. And it has to be, it has to be the bigger countries that, take the lead on this in terms of doing something sensible. Europe is on the path to destroying itself. Germany has all but destroyed its economy. You're seeing the same thing in the United Kingdom. I mean, this is just not a good situation. At some point, people are just going to vote these politicians out. And, we're not quite there yet, but I think we have turned the corner a bit. I mean, the way I look at it, I think we reached peak climate craziness in 2021. I think we've plateaued and we've turned the corner a little bit. But then when you see this situation with the Bovaer and the cows, I mean, I wonder, well, somebody stands to make a lot of money off of this, and they're playing games with people's livelihood and lives. I mean, it's just a terrible situation.
I think that also another problem is that the younger generation, because they are now, they're heading towards their 30s, and they're going to be the decision makers and active participants of the society. However, they all of them deeply do believe in what I just said, that we are going to cause irreversible damage. And if you go and just do a basic research, even if you don't believe it, let's say you don't believe these things, but let me just check, right? Look at this. The first things that you come up with are these graphs. If you look at this graph for the first time, I mean, you can literally see it's going up. This is the basic thing. That's the first thing that comes up when it comes to global temperatures. And you look at these tables and you're like, whoa, yes, the temperature is increasing. So they are telling the truth. And another thing when I said is, how do we know that methane is actually, or CO2 emissions are causing global warming? They were like, well, it's obvious. It's obvious.
Not at all obvious, yeah. In the US, I've seen, like, the young adults, like I said, particularly in the US, I saw peak climate craziness in 2021. I think the youth is just becoming, distracted from this issue, and, they don't see any imminent danger, and they're getting on with their lives. And, that I think there's a change underway in the youth and the young adults in the US. And I don't see it in Europe, and I don't have much way to judge what's going on in Asia. But I think with time, and nobody's seeing, these big disasters happening, and, people will just get on with their lives and worry about things that are more immediate and closer to home, and real problems that they have a chance of addressing, rather than these things. Even if we were successful at net zero, we wouldn't see any change in the weather and climate through the 21st century. There's so much natural climate variability, and the timescales in the oceans and the ice sheets are so long that, you know, that this is embedded into what's going on for the next century or two. So there will be a slow creep of warming from CO2 emissions, and we can't stop that. I mean, we can make it less worse to the extent that it's bad in the 23rd century or something, but, you know, who knows? We could be headed for another ice age by then, and we might appreciate the extra warmth. There's just no way to be predicting these things, you know, beyond a few decades. And, you know, we just don't know how the climate of the 21st century is going to play out. The UN pretends like carbon dioxide is a control knob, you know, that we dial it up, dial it down, there'll be more warming, less warming, and that we can stop the warming if we reach net zero. Well, you know, we can't. The natural climate variability is still going to be very large. And there's a certain amount of warming that's baked in for a while from the long time scales in the oceans and the ice sheets. So, you know, we can't control it. CO2 is not a control knob for the climate on the time scale of decades.
You also mentioned that there are other variables like clouds, ocean,
Yeah.
solar, and how much of a percentage do you think? Do you have anything like? Can you tell me like a approximate percentage of what is human-driven global warming is? What is the variable? How much is the contribution?
Okay, we don't know. Like I said, there's a factor of 3 uncertainty in how sensitive the climate is to CO2. So if it's on the low end, then it's mostly natural variability. If it's on the high end, then CO2 is dominating. And you mentioned clouds. Clouds are a big, big control variable. Since 2015, global cloudiness has been decreasing. And this big spike of temperature that we saw starting in 2023 is mostly coming from the solar radiation, more sun coming in because the cloudiness is reduced. It had nothing to do with CO2. It basically had to do with clouds and more sunlight, you know, making it to the surface. That's what's been going on the last couple of years. So why do we suddenly have fewer clouds? Well, that's definitely natural weather and climate variability. But we've seen a trend in declining cloudiness since 2015. And, you know, this is part of these multi-decadal ocean circulation patterns that sometimes you have high clouds, sometimes you have low clouds. I mean, it's only a few percentage change in cloudiness, but that's a much bigger impact than CO2 in terms of just letting that extra sunshine make it to the surface and warm things up. So there's so many things going on. And then we have the Hunga Tonga volcano. I mean, usually when volcanic eruption, this was in 2022, I guess, they emit a bunch of sulfate particles into the stratosphere, and those reflect sunlight, and therefore we have cooling from a volcanic eruption. Hunga Tonga was a very rare volcano. It was about 150 feet or meters below the ocean, you know, the surface of the ocean, and when it erupted, it spewed a huge amount of water vapor into the stratosphere, high levels, you know, above the levels where even planes fly. And once it gets into the stratosphere, it stays there a long time, and it has a warming effect. It changes circulation patterns. It had a big impact on the 2023 ozone hole and the Antarctic sea ice. You especially saw big impacts in the winter hemispheres, earlier in the southern hemisphere and then subsequently in the northern hemisphere winter. I mean, and scientists are just still trying to sort this out, and blaming the recent spike in warming on CO2 is ridiculous, because CO2 warming is a slow creep. What we're seeing is reduction in cloudiness and some very complex impacts from the Hunga Tonga eruption. So, you know, a lot of complicated things going on here that we don't have a good quantitative understanding that allows us to say, you know, this percent is human caused and this percent is natural. So, you know, 50-50, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. I would say 50-50 is not unreasonable, but, you know, some people say it's 100%. Everything that we see is caused by fossil fuel emissions. And I would say it isn't. If climate sensitivity to CO2 is on the low end, and I think it is, then we have a bigger role for natural climate variability and what we've already seen and what we'll see for the remainder of the 21st century. So it's just uncertain. So, given these uncertainties, I mean, this is a big theme in my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk. Given these uncertainties, what do you do? The UN approach has been the precautionary principle. Okay, we'll get rid of fossil fuels. Well, this causes more problems than it solves. But there's a lot of decision-making strategies when you have deep uncertainty that you can do. Look for the win-win or no regret solutions. I mean, everybody can agree that more energy research and development would be good. Air and water pollution is bad, getting rid of the worst, like from coal burning and things like that, is good. Those are two obvious things that we should be doing. And most importantly, we need to adapt to weather and climate extremes. I mentioned previously, water, too little, too much, the droughts and the floods. I mean, some regions have both, not at the same time, but, and so you have to figure out how to engineer and manage your water resources with dams and reservoirs and all this kind of thing. So that's where we should focus. And better warnings for extreme events, for the hurricanes or the floods or the heat waves. Once you have better warnings, you can, protect yourself, protect your home, protect the infrastructure, all these things if you have enough warning. So a lot of this is just operational, better warnings and better responses. So we minimize, loss of life and property damage, and we minimize the downtime from our electric utilities. That's a big issue. When we get one of these really bad storms, the electricity goes out and the infrastructure is damaged, and sometimes it's down for, a week or something like that. And then you have secondary problems and even loss of life from that. So, figuring out how to deal with those issues. I mean, extreme climate and weather extremes have always happened, for the last 4.6 billion years. They're happening now, and they're going to happen in the future. And we need to figure out how to deal with them better and reduce our vulnerability to these extremes. And humans have been doing that, ever since they've been around. And now that we have electricity and cement and steel and whatever, all of this helps us reduce our vulnerability even further. But energy is really key to helping us reduce our vulnerability to weather and climate extremes. And all these actions to basically jeopardize our energy infrastructure and our reliable energy supplies just makes us even more vulnerable to these extremes from climate and weather.
So what I'm hearing is there are so many variables, and we cannot measure how much is human driven in the climate change and the global warming. We cannot predict it, and we should care about our immediate needs. I mean, if you think about it, we humans, we always first we think about food, shelter. The first immediate things our needs are met, and then we go out and venture doing certain things. And seems to be like the basic thing, basic law of nature. You take care of yourself, whether you're fed, you have shelter, and then you do other things. So given how much poverty in the world and wars, we for some reason are concentrating in these kind of products that we are adding into making sure that the cows do not do their natural thing. And it just seems so absurd. And I wish that they could. What do you think can be done? So before we go to that, what can we do? What are like measures we can take? I wanted to ask you. Um, you mentioned something in the other interview about the West Antarctic ice sheet that sits on a continent. Can you tell me more about that?
Okay, now if anything like really bad is going to happen on the time scale of the 21st or 22nd century, I think it would be associated with the West Antarctic ice sheet. This is like maybe 10% of the region of the overall Antarctic ice sheet. But what makes it different is it's a marine ice sheet. If you took the ice sheet away, sort of the ground that it's on would be well underwater. So it's, ice that is built up that is above the water line, but it's grounded well below. And so it's an unstable ice sheet, and it moves much more rapidly than the, bigger ice sheets. And so, when you see there's a lot of calving, when you break off big chunks of these marine ice sheets, and that happens with regularity. You see, oh my gosh, a chunk broke off the size of whatever, and it's big, but it's really sort of natural. So there's a lot of natural things going on. Melting from above isn't the driver. Warming of the ocean, the Southern Ocean near Antarctica, could sort of melt it away a bit. But, and that's sort of a global warming thing. And there's various instabilities that could happen. But to me, the biggest issues is that there's an estimated 80 volcanoes underneath the ice sheet. A few of them are even active. Okay. And so you're getting a lot of heating from below. And, this has to vary in time. I mean, this is natural. And the other thing is, once you melt, then it's very sort of elastic. Then you see the ground raising up. So there's some rebound. It's incredibly complex. During the last interglacial, which was like 119,000 years ago, when we had another warm period away from the ice ages, the West Antarctic ice sheet, it didn't collapse, but it was believed to be smaller than it is today. So it's possible that we could see, some more loss of ice from the West Antarctic ice sheet, or it's possible that, it could rebound. There's a lot of natural processes in play. It's not just about warming. But if the whole West Antarctic ice sheet were to go, there would be very like meters of sea level rise, not maybe up to 2 meters on the time scale of the 21st century, but there's no signs of that happening. And if it were to happen, my guess is it would be caused more by volcanoes or something like that, rather than human-caused warming. So it's just, part of the world we live in, part of nature. Actually, the last 150 years have been relatively benign in terms of weather and climate. It's been overall a nice period. In the 1600s, 1500s, 1700s, this was a little ice age. And it was, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, the winters in North America and Eurasia were absolutely terrible. There were tons of floods. There were bad hurricanes. Overall, the weather was much worse in the Little Ice Age. And we started coming out of the Little Ice Age around 1850. And that's when we saw this slow warming increase. The volcanic activity was lower, the solar, the ocean circulations were supporting some warming. And then around 1950, and then it warmed in the 30s. And this is when we saw some pretty big melting in the Greenland ice sheet. And then around 1940s, really through the 70s, we saw some decreases in global temperature. And then around 1980 is when we saw the big increase starting again. And those are tied, all of that sort of multi-decadal is really tied in a major way to the large-scale ocean circulation patterns in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So, there's so many things going on. And, blaming this all on fossil fuels is just really ignorant. And it doesn't,
yeah. It just seems like there are so many things that could happen. And what you just mentioned, volcanoes. So it doesn't even, if that happens, it doesn't even matter if we have stopped people from having energy. If it doesn't even matter if we add food additives to reduce methane emissions. It's not even going to matter. It's just going to be it's just going to override all the efforts that we do, and it's going to happen over and over again.
The ice ages, for hundreds of thousands of years, we've seen ice ages, and the interglacials are relatively short, maybe 20,000 years. They're not that long. And then you have many, 100,000 years of ice age. So if we're on schedule, not that it's all that regular, but in maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years, we could be seeing another ice age. So a little bit of human-caused warming, would help stave that off. We would probably figure out ways to geoengineer our way out of another ice age in some way. I don't know, by putting soot on the glaciers and having the sun melt. I don't know what we would do. We would probably have some much better ideas in 1,000 years from now that I can't even think of. But there are huge forces in play from natural climate variability, and the ice ages and the interglacials, are huge. And following the beginning of the current interglacial, I mean, there was a big, they call them the Dansgaard-Oshur events, where we had a big decrease in temperature and then a big, huge increase, like 10 degrees centigrade magnitude, on the time scale of a century. I mean, it's huge variations coming naturally. Exactly what caused that is a subject of debate. But these wild things can happen from natural climate variability. And thinking that we can control all this with our CO2 emissions is just a fairy tale.
And also, you also mentioned about how instead of desertification that is prognosed, there's actually greening that is happening. Can you tell me more about that?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Since like the 1980s, we've had satellites, up there that are measuring, the color of the land, if you will. And the satellite instruments became more sophisticated with time, but we've seen a substantial greening, over the last 40 years, and particularly the last few decades. A lot. There's only like maybe a few places on the Earth where it's gone toward the browner side, but most of it has been, substantially greening. So a couple of things. Plants like warmer temperatures, and they like more rain, and they also like CO2. So, the current climate where we're heading to, is good for vegetation, the natural vegetation and agriculture. I mean, if you're growing vegetables in a greenhouse, you're pumping it full of carbon dioxide to promote growth. I mean, there's CO2 is plant food. So, nobody's ever really done an accounting, the benefits versus the cost, of CO2 warming. The UN Climate Assessment Report, group, the IPCC, was charged at looking for dangerous human-caused climate change. They weren't charged with looking at natural climate variability, and they weren't charged with looking at any benefits from additional CO2 or from warming. So nobody's ever really done that accounting. But we're,
God forbid if you do that. I mean, that would probably.
Yeah, but you can. It's impressive. You can definitely see it on the satellite images. The planet is greening almost everywhere. It's amazing, really.
Wow. Okay, that's actually good news. That's one good news that I can tell the other younger people, that we're not getting.
Okay, but the other piece of good news, and I mentioned this before, but it needs to be emphasized. Far more people globally, this is every country, it's like by about a factor of 10, die from extreme cold events than from extreme warm events. Okay, so if we move the temperatures higher, yeah, there'll be, maybe some more deaths from heat, but there will be far fewer deaths from cold extremes. So the net impact on mortality from temperature extremes would be favorable with warming. And the IPCC even noted is that there are far fewer heat deaths than they were even a few decades ago, because we figured out how to adapt. Well, air conditioning is an obvious one, but we certainly don't have that in developed countries. But they have cooling stations, and people have, figured out how to better manage the extreme heat, and we've adapted to the extreme heat in some ways. So this is even acknowledged in the UN Climate Assessment Report, that we have become less vulnerable to heat extremes. So that's an example of adaptation, and we just need to do more of that. So I think we're managing the heat pretty well. Now we need to figure out how to manage the water, the too little, too much. And I think that should be top priority. And then we have the coastal issues related to sea level rise. But okay, a lot of, again, from satellite, when you look at global land, we see some of these expand, some of it's expanding, like Bangladesh, is sort of the poster child for, dangerous sea level rise because they're so low level. But with the deltas and everything, their land is actually expanding, due to other factors. And some of the atolls, Nauru, and these little atoll islands, that are at figure they're going to be drowned in a decade or two, their land mass is actually expanding, and some of these islands are developing quite a bit, and their land mass is actually growing, just from geologic processes. So the whole sea level, and a lot of the places where sea level rises the worst, off the coast of Indonesia and the US Gulf Coast, for example, a lot of that has more to do with sinking, okay, than the actual sea level rise. So, there's a lot of engineering that can be done to the coast that can help this issue in places where it's bad. But at some point, in some locations, you may need to retreat. But, that's just part of, these islands and the barrier islands off the US the coast. They're basically big glorified sandbars. This is like Miami Beach. You go to a little tiny sandbar with all these high-rise condos on it. These sandbars are not permanent geologic features. They come and go with storms and whatever. People are still going to build on them because they're very desirable locations, but occasionally you're going to get wiped out. And there's not much you can do about it. So
Right.
Florida in the US has been very proactive with their engineering and their building codes and their protocols for managing the electric utilities through these very serious storms. So there's a lot that you can do to adapt to extreme weather. And we need to get on with it and deal with that and stop blaming everything on human-caused warming. Well, I can't fix that. Okay, here's an example from Asia, Lake Chad. Okay, it sustains, a huge population, and began drying up with a drought. Okay, and then the rains return, but the lake is still drying up because people are just pulling so much water out of the lake to irrigate rice. Okay, and it's just running out of water because they're irrigating for rice. I mean, they could have kept the water and imported the rice. It's just, certain decisions that were made, but the president throws up his hand. I can't do anything about Lake Chad because it's fossil fueled warming. Well, no, that's not true. It has to do with governance and how you're using that water. So a lot of bad decisions are being excused by blaming it on fossil fueled warming.
Right. So instead of having these alarmist doomsday headlines and scaring everybody into giving up our freedom, not traveling, because when you travel, there's carbon footprint, eating products that are coming from cows that apparently, have been fed with toxic chemicals. Instead of this, we could actually, in a calm, quiet manner, tackle and have better governance, build and engineer. And I'm sure that everyone can, I mean, we can all fit in this on this planet, can't we? Even if there's no livable space. I mean, that seems to be one of the, but we can fit in here. There's a lot of land.
I know. I mean, this is the point. Once you break this down into human-sized problems that are local, and then everybody can agree on the solution. Yeah, we need to do this. Yeah, we need to make sure we don't run out of water in a drought or something like that. Everybody can agree on the goals, and then everybody can be part of the solution. And you don't get this political gridlock, alarmists versus the deniers, and all of this kind of stuff. A key point that I make in my book is that the better strategy is to agree on solutions. Don't agree on assumptions. We're never going to agree on what's causing all this. We don't need to. Let's agree on the solutions, okay? And that can reduce our vulnerability to weather and climate extremes, whatever their cause. And then we can make progress on those, on our local prosperity, on those UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we can stop wasting all of our money and our manpower on this silliness, and not to mention the psychological angst, particularly in the young people, that is just sapping their energy and their will to, really be, happy and productive members of society.
And I think that the problem is that I have noticed that there's like the feeling of giving up. I think they're just like, there's nothing I can do. All this China, India, because we are doing so much in the Western hemisphere, like we are eating from plastic, what is it, the paper straws, but they're still burning fuel and we can do nothing about it. And we're heading into this devastation and catastrophe. And when they are demoralized, they're like, okay, we're going to die anyways. What's the point of doing anything? And that's the worst part of it.
Well, okay. I mean, and here's the way I deal with that. I said, at most, we're talking about another 1.2 degrees centigrade for the remainder of the 21st century, maybe 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we've already experienced that amount of warming since 1900. Okay, so and we did fine for the last century. If we protect our wealth and develop wealth and develop our populace and educate them and whatever, we can do even better for the next 100 years and the next 1.2 degrees centigrade warming. So we just need to get on with it and prosper. And then we have, if we have economic development and we have wealth, then we can protect ourselves from whatever Mother Nature throws at us, whether it's fossil fueled warming or something natural. So we just need to change our priorities here. It's a different mindset, but it's one that can be exhilarating and can promote positive action. Everyone can be part of the solution. The UN approach is we all put on our hair shirt and we have to suffer and use less electricity and, don't eat meat, or if we eat meat, it's poisoned cow meat. And, we don't travel and we have, we can only walk for 15 minutes, in our little city. And what kind of a life is that? And that's not what people want. So we need to dream big and become prosperous and try to figure out how to deal with the problems in our community, our state, our country, and these are human-sized problems that we can make progress on in the short term and that we can benefit from, whether or not fossil fuel warming turns out to be a significant problem.
I love that. Thank you so much.